In the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean, where the water glimmers like liquid glass, there was once an island its people called a gift from paradise. Bikini Atoll. Quiet, green, and untouched. A world that had changed little from the time of their ancestors. But in 1946, a very different world arrived. An armada of American warships, scientists, generals, and bombs. Bombs unlike anything the planet had ever seen. And on the day when the first light of the atomic age rose over this small island, Bikini Atoll disappeared. Not from the maps, but from history, from the lives of its people, and from its own future. This is the story of how one island was sacrificed in the name of science, and how that sacrifice still radiates through time, in a place where no wave, no wind, and no silence has ever been able to wash it away. Before the nuclear test began, Bikini Atoll was a small, isolated Micronesian community. In early 1946, the population consisted of 167 residents. Their daily life revolved around fishing, collecting coconuts, and maintaining traditional settlements that had changed very little over centuries. The people of Bikini had no exposure to modern military technology and no understanding of what a nuclear weapon was. It was one of the most remote and stable regions in the Pacific, and for that reason, it was selected. In 1946, the United States Navy identified Bikini Atoll as a suitable platform for nuclear weapons testing. The area was distant, isolated, and at that time, politically easy to control. The Marshall Islands were under U.S. administration as a United Nations Trust territory, which meant the local population had no real ability to influence American decisions. When the first U.S. naval vessels appeared on the horizon, the island's residents did not yet know that their homeland had been designated as a strategic military asset. The decision to relocate them had already been made, without their consent. In February 1946, a U.S. Navy delegation arrived at Bikini Atoll. The official purpose was to inform the local population about upcoming nuclear weapons tests. The real objective was to ensure the island was completely evacuated so it could be converted into a military proving ground. American officials presented the island's leader, Chief Judah, with what they described as a temporary relocation for the advancement of science and for the good of mankind. In reality, internal U.S. communications already acknowledged that the scale of the tests would be immense and the long-term effects unpredictable. Although the Bikinians were formally asked whether they agreed to leave, the situation allowed no genuine choice. The Marshall Islands were under full U.S. administrative control as a UN trust territory, and refusing an American military directive was not a realistic option. On March 7, 1946, all 167 residents of Bikini Atoll were evacuated. They were moved to Rongerik Atoll, a significantly smaller and resource-poor island that lacked adequate food and fresh water. The people of Bikini were told the relocation would be temporary. What they were not told was that the United States had already planned an extended series of large-scale nuclear detonations that would last for more than a decade. After the evacuation of the Bikini people, the United States moved quickly to convert the atoll into a full-scale nuclear testing range. The operation was given the codename Crossroads, a reference to what American officials described as the moment when the world stood at the intersection of conventional warfare and the nuclear age. The U.S. military assembled one of the largest post-war naval formations ever created for a single experiment. A target fleet of 95 ships was positioned inside the Bikini Lagoon. These included captured Japanese and German vessels, obsolete American warships, submarines, landing craft, support ships, and several aircraft carriers. Among them the USS Saratoga. Each ship was fitted with instruments to measure blast pressure, thermal radiation, and radioactive contamination. On the surrounding islands, thousands of U.S. personnel constructed observation towers, camera stations, bunkers, and instrument arrays. More than 42,000 servicemen were deployed to the Marshall Islands to support the operation, a number comparable to the population of a mid-sized city. Crossroads was not designed simply to test nuclear weapons. Its objective was to examine how atomic bombs would affect naval equipment, military infrastructure, and the ability of fleets to operate in a nuclear battlefield environment. In essence, the U.S. Navy intended to determine whether traditional sea power could survive the atomic era. By mid-1946, Bikini Atoll, once an isolated Micronesian settlement, had been transformed into one of the most militarized scientific complexes on Earth. On July 1, 1946, the United States carried out the first nuclear detonation at Bikini Atoll. The test was designated Able, and it was planned as an airburst designed to evaluate how a nuclear explosion would affect naval vessels positioned inside the lagoon. The bomb, codenamed Gilda, was identical to the weapon used against Nagasaki. It was dropped from a B-29 bomber flying at an altitude of roughly 9 kilometers. The intended target was the center of the target fleet, but the bomb missed its precise aim point due to pilot error and detonated slightly off target. The Able detonation produced a bright white-orange fireball and a shockwave that reached the surrounding ships within seconds. The blast damaged dozens of vessels, but only 4 were sunk. Because the explosion occurred farther from the planned coordinates, much of the expected data was incomplete or inconclusive. One observation, however, became immediately clear. Even an inaccurately delivered atomic bomb was powerful enough to neutralize a naval formation. A second problem also emerged. Many ships were contaminated with radioactive materials that could not be removed, even with aggressive decontamination efforts. Able was only the beginning. The U.S. Navy decided to continue the tests in pursuit of more precise results. The true shock of the atomic age at Bikini would come on July 25th with the detonation of an underwater device, the Baker test. On July 25, 1946, the United States conducted the second test of Operation Crossroads. Designated Baker, it would become one of the most dramatic and hazardous experiments of the early nuclear age. Unlike the Able test, this device was not dropped from the air. It was detonated underwater at a depth of approximately 27 meters. The bomb carried the same yield as the weapon used on Nagasaki, about 23 kilotons. But the underwater environment altered the detonation in ways the U.S. military had not fully predicted. Baker immediately demonstrated that a nuclear explosion underwater behaves far more destructively than one in the air. The first visible effect was a massive water column, propelled nearly 300 meters into the air. Inside this column was a dense mixture of radioactive debris drawn from the lagoon floor. Around it rose a thick brown radioactive cloud known as the base surge, an aerosol so contaminated that it blanketed the ships, testing platforms, and even nearby islands. The underwater shockwave was severe enough to lift several ships out of the water, breaking some of them apart within seconds. The aircraft carrier USS Saratoga, one of the largest vessels in the formation, sank within minutes, despite being heavily reinforced. But the true danger of Baker was not immediately visible. The detonation produced extreme levels of radioactive contamination, described by US scientists as practically unmanageable. Radioactive particles adhered to every surface: deck plating, hull seams, metal structures, even the lingering water spray. None of the contaminated ships could be successfully decontaminated. Following the Baker test, some researchers recommended canceling all future underwater detonations due to the uncontrollable spread of radiation. A few issued explicit warnings that such tests could become unmanageable nuclear pollution of maritime regions. At the time, these warnings were dismissed. The nuclear age had just begun, and the US military was determined to collect as much data as possible. After the Able and Baker tests, Bikini Atoll was not returned to its original inhabitants. Instead, the United States chose to expand the testing program. From 1946 to 1958, Bikini became one of the most heavily bombarded locations on Earth. Over 12 years, the United States detonated 23 nuclear weapons at the atoll, including several thermonuclear devices. The site functioned as a controlled laboratory for studying new nuclear designs, blast geometry, fallout distribution, and the survivability of military assets under atomic conditions. One of the most powerful detonations occurred in 1954. The test known as Castle Bravo, a 15-megaton hydrogen bomb, was hundreds of times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Although Bravo is a separate story in itself, its fallout contaminated large areas of the Pacific, including multiple atolls of the Marshall Islands. Throughout these years, Bikini Atoll was transformed into an uninhabitable environment. Lagoon floors were cratered, island surfaces were burned, and vast areas became radioactive zones. Some detonations created craters visible from orbit, one of them measuring roughly 1.8 kilometers across. These tests revealed to scientists the extreme dangers of radiation. But during the Cold War era, the US military made no serious effort to slow or halt the program. As long as Bikini Atoll remained strategically valuable, nuclear testing continued. By the end of 1958, Bikini Atoll had been effectively destroyed as a living ecosystem, and its original inhabitants were never able to return to a truly safe homeland. After the Baker detonation and the subsequent tests, it became clear that the nuclear explosions at Bikini Atoll created a level of contamination the US military was not prepared to manage. Radiation levels were far higher and more widespread than planners had predicted. Many of the naval vessels used in the tests became so heavily contaminated with radioactive particles that they could not be safely decontaminated. Teams attempted to wash the metal surfaces with high-pressure hoses, scrub decks with chemical agents, and strip contaminated coatings. But the radioactive residue had penetrated every seam, joint, and structural cavity. Ultimately, the US Navy concluded that many of these vessels had to be scuttled, not because of physical damage, but because the radiation could not be removed. US military personnel who worked in the test zones were also exposed. Many sailors and support crews, often inadequately protected, handled contaminated equipment, boarded irradiated ships, and recovered recording instruments from blast areas. In later years, numerous veterans reported elevated rates of cancer, leukemia, skin disorders, and other radiation-linked illnesses. Naval medical archives indicate that some servicemen had operated in regions where radiation levels exceeded safe limits by hundreds of times. The environment suffered long-term damage as well. The lagoon floor became saturated with plutonium, cesium-137, and strontium-90. radioactive sand and sediment were dispersed throughout the ecosystem, contaminating fish, reefs, and shallow water habitats. Post-test surveys found that in certain areas of Bikini Atoll, radiation levels were so high that only a few hours of exposure could trigger acute radiation sickness. Between 1947 and 1953, U.S. scientists conducted multiple attempts to model fallout distribution, but real-world readings consistently exceeded theoretical projections. The nuclear experiments at Bikini fundamentally altered the local ecosystem, leaving it dangerously unpredictable for decades to come. After the people of Bikini were removed from their homeland, their suffering continued for decades. The 167 residents were relocated to Reconstruction Atoll, a place with almost no food, no fresh water, and no capacity to support long-term life. Within months, the community faced severe hunger. Children fell ill, and repeated pleas for assistance went largely unanswered. In 1948, the U.S. acknowledged that Reconstruction was unlivable and moved the Bikinians again, this time to Kwajalein, where they were placed in crowded military barracks. Without land, without traditional food sources, and without stability, their culture was dismantled in a matter of years. In 1957, U.S. officials declared Bikini safe and allowed some families to return. It was a mistake. Radiation levels caused thyroid disorders, tumors, birth defects, miscarriages, and other serious health problems. By 1978, the population was evacuated a second time, permanently. Today, the descendants of Bikini live scattered across the Pacific, dependent on inconsistent compensation, unable to return to a homeland that remains unsafe. Meanwhile, the atoll itself stands as a silent monument to the nuclear age. Palm shadows fall across craters left by hydrogen bombs, and radioactive particles still lie in the soil in the lagoon floor. It is a place without residents, a homeland erased. The people of Bikini lost their land, their culture, and their future. Their story is a reminder that technological power, when pursued without regard for human consequences, can destroy entire communities. Bikini Atoll remains one of the few places on Earth where history did not fade. It lingers in the sand, in the water, and in the memory of those who were forced to leave. A lasting warning. When power becomes more important than people, the scars endure for generations.